drunken sailor? What shall we do with the drunken sailor? What shall we do with the drunken sailor early in the morning?
I'm Paul Bennett, here in Millbridge, Maine. We're right along Maine's Bold Coast, not very far from the U.S.-Canadian border. I'm working on making up the stem, which, because of its thickness, has to be laminated from 2x framing lumber. It also has to be cut, the bevel has to be cut at a fairly wide angle. It's actually a compound bevel on each side, but I'm just going to cut a straight one in the table saw, and then once the stem is mounted in position and I start running a batten around the sides of the hull and checking for fairness, I'll develop the compound bevel with block plane and shape it right in place. And that way there I'll be assured of getting a much better fit, and everything should go smoothly. I have a set of plans. I have a number of drawings here which I did in CAD, which give me all the basic dimensions and what I have to do. The other thing I'm doing in this video is, what I have in front of me is my transom. I'm putting a couple of cleats on it to hold it in place. I'm also making a temporary jig that these cleats will set on. Transom will be held at the proper height and at the proper angle to fit on the boat the way it's supposed to. So that's what I'm working on. I'm also going to, if time allows, I will erect the collision bulkhead. Once all these things are in place and the rest of those frames are all braced up, I'll be ready to start installing the stringers, which will help tie everything together and make everything good and stiff. I'm cutting a 2x8 kiln-dried piece of spruce framing lumber, and I'm cutting it 38 inches long, which is just slightly longer than the stem needs to be, because the stem is going to have an angle cut at each end. And after I cut this, I'm going to cut a 2x6 piece of KD spruce framing lumber, which will be laminated to the top of this piece I'm cutting. Then there'll be an angle cut ripped on the table saw on each side, and that'll provide the basic angle or bevel for the stem. Then I'll cut the other bevels here on the chop saw. Okay, one more piece to cut. This is my 2x6 piece, and what's nice is if I do make a big mistake on this first stem that I'm making, I'll have enough material where I can make another one. I hope I don't have to do that, but I can only buy these 2x and 8-foot lengths. I couldn't get them any shorter, so that leaves me plenty of material left over just in case. Okay, it's my 2x6. So the 2x8. And I'll just find the center line. Those two will end up being laminated together. And what might be easier for me to do and save some strain on the table saw is to figure the bevel on each one, cut them separately, leaving a little extra material that I'll just plane off later. Okay, this is the back section of the stem, back layer, and that's cut to the proper width and the proper angle, which in this case is 41 degrees on each side. Now I have to cut down the 2x6. I cut this one a little bit wider than it needed to be, a little bit proud, because I didn't want it to be too narrow. I can always take a little bit more off, but if you cut it too narrow, you cut too much off, you really can't add wood. I've got it pretty much where I want it. I can glue these two together. I found the center line of both pieces and I lined them up, and then I put some screws in to hold them together, and now I'm going to take them out. When I go, I'm going to put some glue in between here, and when I go to put them back together, these screws will help me align these pieces exactly where they need to be. And if I did that later, if I put the screws in after I glued it, these pieces would be swimming all around. I wouldn't be able to locate them. So this just makes it easier. These screws also act as clamps. So once it's glued and screwed back together, I don't need to use any other clamps. Those will work just fine. Put a couple of pencil marks, give me in the ballpark. If I'm very careful, I can feel the screw as it finds its opening. So now I can go ahead and sink the screws. Since I had these screws in, that initially clamps it, but I want more clamping pressure. So I'm going to put some more screws in. Now that it's all lined up, I don't have to worry about it sliding around. This will help distribute, put more pressure more evenly. And when this glue is dry, I'm going to put one at each end here. Oops. When this glue is dry, I'm going to remove all these screws. They won't stay in there. I won't need them. Alright, so my stem is made. The only thing I have to do now is there is a bit of a bevel on each end, or an angle I have to cut off at each end, but I won't do that until the glue dries and I take these screws out. I don't want to accidentally cut into a screw on the end. So at each end we'll have a bevel cut, and then of course these edges, they stick out a little bit, it's still in the rough. But after this is already mounted on the boat and in position, that's when I'll go back and do the final shaping on the sides here. Is, truth be known, there is a slight curvature, it's not a straight bevel, but I've got plenty of material left here, so I can fit it just right. So that's it for laminating up the stem. Now I have to make a jig for my transom. This is the back edge of the transom without the curvature on the top, if it were just straight across. The jig that I made has to come back from that line 5 7/16 inches. So just mark on both sides. I'm going to take this jig that I made to hold the transom, and the back edge has got to line up with those lines I just drew, and then it'll be in the proper position. Then I just have to try to line up the center line as best I can. And I can make more adjustments later, but for now I'm going to try to get it wherever as close as I can. Wow, I'm pretty close. I think I'm gonna call this good. Yeah, it's pretty much right on there. I don't think I can get it any better than that. So just to keep it from shifting on me, I'm gonna clamp up one side. I'm gonna screw this down so it doesn't shift around. And this is gonna be pretty solid. I'm putting in 3-inch screws. I'm gonna put 4 of them in, 2 on each side. And that should lock her down pretty good. I don't think the transom's going to go anywhere. So when I finish screwing this in, I can now hang the transom in place. And then I'm going to temporarily screw the transom onto this jig. That'll keep that from moving around. It'll be pretty solid. Yeah, that's solid. You can see this cleat here on the back of the transom, and that's supposed to rest right across the top here. And I can just shift it until I get it aligned. This gives me the proper angle of the transom. Remember, this is upside down. Well, what do you know? Get it lined up a little better. I pre-drew some of the lines so I could line up the center line on the back side. I had the center line marked on my jig, so that gets me where I need to be. When I start wrapping the battens over the hull to check the fairness of the hull, making adjustments, if I have to, I can shift this one way or the other and make sure everything's right. And then I'll probably run a plumb line right down the center line here, just make sure everything is right. I drew some lines which are going to line up with the center of the boards that make up the jig, so I can put some screw into it. And these screw holes, when I pull the screws out later, they'll just be filled with thickened epoxy, so it'll be just fine. Well, that's on there pretty rugged, and I don't think I have to brace it up any more than that, although I certainly could if I had to. I think that's on there pretty decent. Another design change I'm thinking about is, just like I have a collision bulkhead up forward, I'm thinking about putting one back aft right here, just aft of this frame. I can run the footwell all the way to that collision bulkhead so that it's watertight between the transom and that watertight bulkhead. So no water can get from this back end into the main hull, unless you had a very serious collision, but I'm thinking about doing that. I also thought about cutting an outboard motor well. When this is right side up, this will be the port side, and I thought about cutting an opening for the outboard and putting an inboard motor well for the auxiliary outboard motor. I don't know if I really want to go through that trouble, but something to think about. Even though I basically designed this hull and I drew up the plans, whenever I come up with a new design and I'm building it, I'm building the prototype, I have a tendency to do some redesign and upgrades as I come up with ideas during the build process. If I do decide to do that, then of course I'll upgrade the drawings. Because somebody sent me a private message, and they asked me how come I haven't released plans yet for this boat, because I said I would release the plans for free in PDF format, and they want to know where they were, how come they're not released. The reason for that is, just as I had explained, I'm not finished yet. During this whole build process, I'm doing a number of upgrades and redesigns and changing my mind and doing things a little differently. And so I'm changing the plans as I go. So if I release them now, you're not going to have a set of plans that would reflect on what the final design is going to be. When it's finished, I will work up the plans that I can release based on my final design. And then if you like it and you want to build it, then feel free. I'm not charging anything for them. That's it for the transom being in position. And you'll notice I did not cut the transom bevels yet. Okay, I'm going to install the collision bulkhead. Unlike the main frames, it doesn't have any cross pieces because it's solid. I've already installed the jig to hold it onto the strongback. This is basically the same as all the rest. They're all the same height. Oh. The back of the collision bulkhead has a cleat on it, so there's something to rest on top of these cleats to be at the right height. So we'll just set it up there. Now it's just a matter of getting it lined up properly. Lined up with the center line. I'll just do this by eye for now. And then I'll look at the back side where I have center lines marked. And once again, I'm just using a drywall as T-square. Now, because I really can't clamp it, so I'm just going to put some screws through here temporarily to hold it in place. That'll keep it from shifting around. And again, once the boat's built, I will take the screws out. I will fill them in with thickened epoxy. And there I have my collision bulkhead installed. What I'm doing now is I'm making a simple jig that I'm going to attach to the stem, and then I will attach this jig right onto the strongback, and this is going to hold the stem in the correct position of where it needs to be when I start building the boat. You really can't see it in the camera, but I have this chop saw angled over at only 2 degrees. It's a very, very shallow angle. And then I will cut this to the proper length. And remember, again, I have that water line that I set so that everything is at the proper height. Where I hung all the frames, well, the stem, that's also a reference point for the stem as well. So this jig will reflect that. You'll see what I'm talking about when it goes on. I'm also cutting this board here at a 2-degree angle, but instead of this way, I'm doing it this way, right across here. This is going to be part of the jig, and this backs up the piece, the smaller piece you just saw me cut, and you'll see why that is in just a moment when I begin assembly. This is the base of the jig, and that's going to go right on the strongback. And this happens to be 1.5 inches, which is the perfect height for this jig. And then I have this piece, the bevel cut down here, so it's a little bit of an angle, 2 degrees. It's going to go like this. And then this piece, I have the bevel cut down this end. That's also 2 degrees, so that meets. And this is how the jig will look when it's constructed. The stem goes right here in the front, and I'll mount the stem by putting screws through the jig and into the stem. That'll hold it, and then when I place this on the strongback, I can maneuver it where I want it and then place some screws right through the base piece and into the strongback, and that will hold the stem in place. At least that's the theory. So I'm going to start putting this together and see how it goes. Just for good measure, I'll put a few more screws in here, keep it nice and tight, rigid, keep it from moving about. And I drew a center line along here so that I know where to put the screws once it's lined up. Should have thought of this beforehand. It would have been easier to do it before I put this together. Okay, just going to get some pocket screws. Okay, put a pocket screw on each side. Alrighty, so there it is. Here's my jig. I just finished marking and drawing a center line on the back side of the stem. Remember this jig that you probably just saw me made in the video. Remember, this 1.5 inches sticks out beyond the stem, and what I'm doing is I'm lining up the center lines, and I want to make sure that both sides are even, just the right amount sticking up, and make sure that this is on the center line. Okay, what I want to do now is I want to extend that center line, because I can't see it on the stem. It'll give me a reference to go by. Okay. It'll just give me a visual reference if I can get these all lined up. What I just did is I screwed directly through the jig and into the stem. And just double check these marks. See if it shifted. Nope, it's okay in that end. I'll put one on this end. Okay, so now I'm just going to put in a few more screws so that the stem is securely fastened onto the jig. And I know where the front part of the jig has to go. The forward part of I made a line right here. I measured back from the stem line, and that's where the edge of that jig goes. Like that. Yeah, let me make sure that I'm lined up. No, it's got to come forward a little. Let's see if anything moved. Looks like it did a little bit, not by much. That looks pretty good. Yep, right on the marks. No, I didn't realize this wasn't in the frame when I was installing it. I mean, it was down here, but I didn't realize that part of this was cut off, but now you can see it.
What shall we do with the drunken